Hi, it's Professor Chew. It's actually Saturday evening here in California. And well, I suspect most of you probably would prefer to do other things besides listen to me talking about Greek politics and history. On a Saturday night, I want you to know that I have been using YouTube live stream to make these videos lately. And because they are live streamed, if you ever want to hear them and ask me questions live, that would be great, actually. So I can send out a message in the future about when I do this as a live stream. So if you happen to be near your computer, you can actually listen and watch in real time, for better or for worse. This week, we're talking about the polis in Athens and Sparta and some ancient forms of government, namely the oligarchy, the tyranny, and the democracy. And so, in other words, we're after our discussion of examination of justice in Hesiod, which I know is a little bit more abstract. And Hesiod, one thing you'll find about ancient authors is they don't just say, oh, this is what justice is. They usually off on a discussion about it. So it's up to you to read the text, interpret it, think about what they are trying to say. So I will have more to say about that when I look at your short papers this week. Also noting that, yes, this is the week when we have our first long essay due. So for that essay, and I'll make a separate video about that, but you are to take one short essay and develop it into a longer one, and have some instructions about how to go about doing that on the assignment page. So please check that out. But I will also have a separate video just about that. About the Greek polis. Well, there's a couple ways to define a polis. It is a fortified settlement on a height. And Homer even calls the polis the Acrea Acrotate. And that's a good example of this is the Acro-Corinth. So this is the ancient city of Corinth, a major Greek city in the ancient Greek world, ruled actually by a tyrant, an oligarchy, raised completely by the Romans. So not much of it left today, but the Acro-Corinth, again, indicates the top of the city. And so again, one way to think about a polis is that it's the buildings and walls of a city, but it can often include the lands around it. So while this might be, the ancient center of the city, because many polis date back to the Mycenaean era, the polis, as it develops, certainly in Athens, comes to include, again, the lands around it. And again, this is called the Acro-Corinth, that fortified settlement on a height. Polis also comes to mean an urban settlement. And then, as I just said, it also comes to mean an urban settlement that includes the environs, the surrounding land, or the state territory. And this often happens due to population growth, which happens in ancient Greece from the 8th century BCE on. And then it has a more sort of abstract meaning. It's a municipal community of its politai, or citizens, those who live in the polis. Polis often contains a public space, the agora, we talked about at the very first lecture. There are about 1,500 settlements that could be called a polis in the ancient Greek world, and this includes polis in the Aegean Sea, in the islands there, colonial territories. We talked about colonization in ancient Greece on the coast of both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and later will extend to include the kingdoms in the under the Hellenistic Empire. Generally, in a polis, some of the principles that we can see 1,500 polis is that there's some kind of political self-determination and autonomia, or self-government, with a wish by the citizens and a desire or an imperative on internal and external independence. So in other words, not, for instance, forming allies perhaps with an alliance with other polis, but not becoming subject to them. And all polis had some kind of public buildings along with that public space, the agora. They had their own feast days, their own sanctuaries, their own calendar often, their own laws again, an economic system, their own currency, and their own army. And in some cases, they have their own fleet. So this is the Acropolis, the fortified settlement in Athens. And you can think that this is the Parthenon, scaffolding, always under some reconstruction. And as far as the size of a polis, well, Athens definitely has one of the larger polis that develop, and so does Sparta at the height of their, shall we say, at height of classical Greece, with about 30,000 to 50,000 politically enfranchised citizens in Athens and Sparta in the classical era. By politically enfranchised, I do mean those who were able to vote. And that did not include women, not include women, slaves, or foreigners. So we're talking adult male citizens. Polis often is a word that's used in ancient Greek to mean a body of citizens, or koinonia ton politon. And in fact, in Greek writers, polis often refers even more than to some kind of specific territory, Athenae, Thebae, but to that body of citizens. So it's not uncommon to hear a polis referred to as Athenaioi, the Athenians, Lacedaemonioi. This is the Lacedaemonians, another name for the Spartans, and it really suggests how the polis, in addition to above and beyond perhaps being a territorial unit, has a real preoccupation with its identity. Some ways we see this identity is in the fact that all polis had a protecting deity, of course, Athena for Athens, and Sparta. Samos, its protective deity was Hera, the wife of Zeus in Greek mythology, and you can even see that there's a very famous Heraion, or a temple to Hera, in Samos. And I just bring this up, it's also a very well-preserved temple with a very elaborate columnar structure. Remember, Samos is an island in Turkey, in the Aegean Sea, and it's actually today an island that a lot of the refugees who are coming from Syria and the conflicts in the Middle East are stopping on their way to trying to get to Europe. So it's very, very close, in other words, to the western coast of Turkey, or Ionia. So that the Heraion is a good example of this very elaborate temple, of how among the public buildings in a polis, it's really a temple that is really the main building. It's not a palace, So we see mention of palaces, of course, in terms of the Odysseus when he comes back to Ithaca, but there are no palaces really in the polis. Again, that emphasis on citizens. And this indicates the polis is a center of political and religious power. Having which said, it should be noted that not all Greek communities are actually organized as polis, in particular in Western and Northwestern Greece. For instance, Northwestern Greece, and also you see there the tribal state, which is called the ethos. That should be the ethnos. We'll check on that for you by the time you get this slide, is really the main form of organization. And also, just another thing to know about the polis is that in some cases, the polis is formed of several smaller settlements, which are combined into a larger one by expediency, because when you've got other big polis around you like Athens and Sparta, it's probably better to join together than to try to fight individually against the big guys. The name for these smaller settlements joined together is sun oikismos. Sun means together, and oikia is actually the ancient Greek word for a household, as we learned from our previous lecture. So this is what's remained of the Heraion on Samos, an island in the Aegean. And again, not all Greek political or entities are actually polis. For instance, you would call places like Delphi and Olympia religious centers much more. So it's incorrect to me even to say that they're political, although they do actually end up having some role in political events as time passes. This is the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. But these are places that are really, again, religious centers that there might be a polis near them, but they function independently, in other words, and indeed totally unconnected. So Olympia, for instance, is near a polis named Elis, and that's where the judges in Olympia come from, but it is sort of a huge functioning sanctuary to Zeus. And Delphi, of course, is a huge functioning sanctuary, which over time becomes very wealthy and indeed does play a role in politics. This is later. Again, the thing to recognize is that the temple is really in some ways, the most prominent public building in many of these polis, and also that how should we put it? Not all gathered together in communities in ancient Greece, are polis in the way that Athens and Sparta are. with the well-developed political systems. Some places are actually religious centers like Delphi and Olympia, or Eleusis, for instance, outside of Athens, which is not to say that temples do not play a large role in the geography of a polis, as we saw here in the Horion. A map to give you some idea of where all these places are. So here's Athens. This is the Peloponnese, the big southern peninsula of Greece, and here's Sparta. Over here is Corinth. Olympia is over here. Thebes. Thebes is the city where in Greek mythology, for instance, Oedipus is from, and many other Greek heroes. Pentheus, for instance, if you read the Euripides play, the Bacchae. And Thebes was always an oligarchy. Whereas Athens and Sparta, to some extent, I mean, Sparta is an oligarchy too, but has some forms of democratic sort of looking institutions, though not exactly. That's a very vague way to put it, but let's take a closer look at that. So Sparta, also known as Lacedaemonia, well, it's very isolated in the center of the Peloponnese, as you can see. It's not near the sea. Sparta did not have a fleet really until several years into the Peloponnesian War, which is the war from 431 to 404 BCE. And its constitution was really, I guess you could call it mixed, a combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, but really sort of working, and essentially functioning as an oligarchy, or ruled by a few. The Spartans have left us no, major architectural monuments, and it seems that in many ways Sparta was combined with scattered villages that had come together. They all spoke the same dialect, the Dorian dialect, also spoken in Corinth and Syracuse. And the Spartans controlled, which was very fertile, and the Spartans are actually self-sufficient for food. However, most Spartans were not involved in agricultural productivity because the Spartans, unlike their many other city-states, had conquered their neighbors, namely the Messenians. And the Messenians basically functioned for the Spartans as a permanent slave population of other Greeks. They were called the Helots, which is a word that seems to mean someone who has been taken possession of. Messenians, though, actually outnumbered the Spartans and were always liable to rebel. The Spartan government, so we said, it is indeed a combination of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and so some democratic elements, though these were not certainly the strongest ones. The Spartans, as we all know from popular culture, down to maybe what we learned in an ancient history class before, they were developed, shall we say, a military machine. They were a militaristic culture. And they also promoted a very stable government and the promotion of something called eunomia, which means a good order, or literally good laws. So the monarchical aspect, Spartans had two hereditary kings who could serve as military leaders and did, but he primarily had religious functions by the 6th century BCE. Why they had two kings, nobody really understood. I mean, you could almost say that instead of being a monarchy, they were a diarchy. This word means two in ancient Greek. And now they did have an assembly of citizens, so that would be the democratic element, but all did not have the right to make speeches. In other words, it's sort of a limited participation kind of assembly. They also had a gerousia, which this is the aristocratic element. Literally that means a body of elderly people. And indeed, the gerousia was composed of Spartan citizens over the age of 60 who were elected by public acclamation. They had to be from the aristocracy. There were only 28 of them elected for life. And in addition to all this, the Spartans also had officials who were called the ephors. There were 5 of them elected for a year by the assembly, functioning as a judiciary and also looking over day-to-day operations for the Spartan state. An important thing to keep in mind, especially as we go through some later periods of Greek history, is the idea of who qualifies to be a citizen. Well, first of all, you have to be male. Second of all, in Sparta, you have to be a freeborn male and you have to own a certain amount of land. If you don't have a certain amount of land, you wouldn't qualify to be a citizen. The result of this is that the Spartan population is constantly in a state of decline. By the Peloponnesian War, there were only 4,000 citizens of military age. So, all those the stories, if you watch the movie 300 and sequel, all those Spartans marching around, well, their numbers would be greatly diminished, about 100 years after that war, which is the Persian Wars. The Spartans indeed allies for manpower in their battles. And Sparta, again, is being an isolated culture, not near landlocked and not near to any sea, and also with this emphasis on the military, is actually relatively poor in terms of money. I guess I wouldn't exactly say cash, but in terms of things like capital. For instance, Athens at one point, in the around the time of the Peloponnesian War, discovers a huge supply of silver in the mines in Laurentium outside of Athens. It's actually where the Athens airport is now. But this gave Athens, some instant wealth that it could use, and it did. So on to Athens, where, eventually, not I think actually in this lecture, but we're going to talk about it as practicing a kind of extreme democracy. In other words, Athens, if the democracy in the U.S. is a representative democracy, in which we elect our officials and our politicians, and they go to Washington, D.C. and make decisions for us, for better or for worse. The Athenian democracy is a participatory democracy in which all those politically enfranchised male citizens participate in the government. But this democracy, this radical, extreme democracy, only rises after really a century of political upheaval and rule by tyrants in Athens. So a couple of things about Athens. The dialect in Athens is the Ionian dialect, also spoken by Ionians, i.e. those on the western coast of Turkey, Greek speakers on the western coast of Turkey. Athens is actually, it's kind of in a valley. It gets very hot in the summer. And it consists of 3 large plains with mountain ranges in between. It was right on the sea, as you can see here, and welcomes innovation, welcomes new learning, welcomes people coming in from all parts of the world. So not only from the East, from the Near East, but also from, for instance, Northern Africa. Egypt is right over here, Libya, and also from Greek colonies, Southern Italy, Spain. Its economy is primarily consists of farmers and craftspeople, so skilled craftspeople, something again the Spartans don't have, whose industries include timber and charcoal, the timber coming from the mountains, olives, tree of Athena, marble, which you can find plentifully in those mountains again outside of Athens, and pottery. So there are a number of ceramic factories actually that we can see the archaeological remains of in Athens today. The land, this sort of city proper of Athens itself didn't have enough farmland though for its growing population. All the forests, would eventually get used up for charcoal or for timber for ships as Athens developed its navy. And so Athens actually does have reasons for starting to look elsewhere for colonies and allies. And that happens for Athens because Athens becomes, as I said, a great commercial center for the Mediterranean. Well, a difference for the assembly in ancient Athens was that all of its citizens could speak in the assembly, unlike in Sparta, and anyone who could claim Athenian birth was considered a citizen. So around the time of this Peloponnesian War, for instance, which is a little bit later than the period we're at, but Athens has 40,000 citizens, which is a vast number. Compare that to the 4,000 citizens that the Spartans have. So in other words, most of the Athenian army in this Peloponnesian War, which it fights against Sparta, they're Athenians. Those 21,000 could serve as hoplites. And in addition to those 40,000 citizens, there are also 8,000 resident aliens who would serve as hoplites. So if you're a resident alien in ancient Athens, you can't vote, but you can have many other privileges. You can certainly engage in commercial activity, for instance. The Spartans have their Gerousia, their consul. The Athenians, that's a council of 28. The Athenians, they don't have any institution like that, where, the members have to be from the aristocracy and they're elected for life. Instead, along with the assembly, or the ecclesia, the Athenians have a boule, a council of 500, which was, whose members were determined by a lottery. And this boule, and it is the word actually for, the parliamentary body in modern Athens today. It's called the vouli in modern Greek pronunciation. It prepared the business for the assembly. So that can include laws, foreign policy. Athens also had generals who were elected. They're called strategoi, but they all faced scrutiny on leaving office. In other words, they'd have to have their activities and their accounts checked, transparency of government. Juries could be held based on Athenian citizens. They could be up to 501 in number. Big jury. And again, women slaves and medics, who are the resident foreigners, could not participate in other city-states' government. So, and that is obviously, it goes without saying, that's the case for all polis. Women had no place in the political life in ancient Greece, or in anywhere in the ancient world, really. But Athens was not always a democracy. That's one important thing to keep in mind. Originally, it's a monarchy. Its mythical king is Theseus. You can see him here killing the Minotaur. In the 8th and 7th century BCE, so around the time of Homer and Hesiod, it is an aristocracy with some 60 different aristocratic clans. Athenian government at this time contains 3 archons, who were these sort of ruling magistrates who served for 1-year terms, after which they joined the great council of the Areopagus. Areopagus means the hill of Ares. So this is a major court that carried out a number of different duties, but all of these government officials would have only come from the Athenian aristocracy. Over time, what starts to happen is that in Athens, though, the aristocracy could not provide it with a stable government, and with tensions continually growing between the citizen community and also between its countryside around it. So what we start to see, starting around the 7th century, is attempts to overthrow the aristocratic leaders of Athens. For instance, in 632 BCE, a man named Cylon attempts to seize power by taking over the Acropolis, but he doesn't win wider support. His supporters, though, are slaughtered at the instigation of one of these aristocratic clans, the Alcmaeonids, which is a name to remember. They will come up a couple more times, the Alcmaeonids. So the Alcmaeonids, as a result, are expelled from Athens, and a curse is attached to them. So, an example of, someone, again, trying to seize power from the ruling aristocratic families in Athens and failing, but still having enough supporters to result in the exile of a major Alcmaeonid family. Solon. So we're going to read about Solon when we read Herodotus's histories. He's sometimes called the wise man of Athens. And Solon, he's a historical figure with some sort of semi-legendary stories attached to him, or attributes, or innovations. Solon left us with some poetry in which he says that Athens' problems are due to the greediness of the rich, and he sought to mediate between the aristocracy and the poor landowners of Athens. I'm really recognizing, too, that those landowners, of course, can provide valuable manpower. And in particular, manpower with the rise of something called the hoplite warfare. The hoplites is a name for the Greek soldier in this period. A Greek soldier who has to actually furnish his own kit or his own armor of a shield and spears and helmet, and who all fought together in a different way than fighters did in Homeric epics. Namely, the hoplites fought together in what's called a phalanx, which is a line of soldiers with the left holding their shield in their left hand, spear and the sword in the right. So you hold your shield over the right arm of the person to the left of you. So in other words, the hoplites engaged in battle by fighting, this sort of immovable line. If you have watched the movie 300 or many other movies, Hollywood movies about Greek soldiers, this hoplite formation is often imitated. Also in non-Greek history movies like Gladiator. We'll look at the hoplites a little bit more next week too. But again, one reason that Solon recognized the need to keep the poor landowners in mind was the development of this new kind of warfare, which really depended on, large numbers of citizens, soldiers, but also large numbers of citizen soldiers fighting in some kind of unity together in these hoplite ranks in the phalanx. Solon also talks in his poetry at a concept we should be familiar with after reading all that he said last week, dike, justice. righteousness, a sense of order. Solon said that this abstract principle could actually lead to harmony and order. You could form your political state based on decay and have eunomia, good order. So Solon instituted a bunch of reforms that are sometimes called the Solonic Constitution, but they weren't really it was a reform project, but they were really a bunch of individual laws or desmoi, individual pieces of legislation, not necessarily brought together in sort of one grand vision, aside from these ideas in Solon's poetry. What we see Solon doing is opening up the government to a much wider class of citizens than just the rich aristocracy, and also giving the demos much more privilege. In other words, the smallholders, the small landowners. And famously, after Solon establishes his constitution, he actually leaves Greece, and you should read in Herodotus, he actually goes to Ionia and he visits the king Croesus. Leaves after 10 years. You see the laws are good enough to work without him. Some centerpieces of Solon's system is the abolishment of debt. And in particular, a ban on the encroachment of the person of the debtor. You can't pay your debts by selling yourself into slavery. So major innovation ensures that there's no permanent slavery in Athens. He also establishes a family and inheritance law, which is thought to be a way to encourage parents to have sons learn the trade. So in other words, there's another kind of inheritance that can be passed on from father to son. It doesn't have to just be land. And we talked a little bit last time about how one reason many Greeks went to form colonies was because if a father has more than one son, he has to divide up the land. The oldest son gets the plot, the younger sons get less, therefore leave to perhaps to colonize or to found a colony in another place. And Hesiod, of course, says, unless you want to be an old man, you better only have one son, so you can just divide the property up to him. Just give the property to him. Solon establishes what is called a timocratic system, in which there are 4 census classes who are based on their annual agricultural harvest. And he links holding office not to wealth, to how much wealth you have, but not to your lineage. In other words, not to your aristocratic background. This is a chart. The website is where I got it from is here. So these are the 4 different classes that he establishes, and they're all based on, again, how many bushels of grain you can provide, 500, 300, 200, or not that much at all. At the top is still the Areopagus, the ancient court established under the Athenian aristocracy. The archons, there's the popular assembly, the ecclesia. There's also a popular court. It's called the Holaia. So from the classes, from all classes of society, people can join the assembly or the popular court. And in addition, they also have elections for this council of 400. This is just another version of it here with a little more detail. Namely, 100 people from each tribe are selected by lot out of the first 3 classes. Okay, so there's 4 classes. These are the 4 classes based on how many bushels of grain you can provide. The classes are all made up of people from the different tribes in Athens, and 100 people are selected from those tribes as they are distributed across the different classes, and then are make up the council of 400. So in other words, the council is made up of people from different tribes and from people from different levels of income. This chart gives you a little bit of an idea too about the other bodies. So the ecclesia, again, is the assembly, which meets for legislation, leading to laws that are worked out between it and the council of 400. The archons are selected out of the archons only come from the first and second classes, so you still have to be from the wealthiest classes to be an archon. The assembly, the sort of popular court, the Heliaia, comes from the 4 classes. And then the other court, though, the sort of more major court, is the Areopagus, and that only is formed from the those who were former archons. And that supervises all the laws and is the highest court supervision of public offices and functions. So what you see with Solon's constitution is that it's certainly an attempt to lessen the power of income disparity in the government, but still definitely your archons and the Areopagus, or the higher ranks of society, the top law court and the officials, all come only from those first two classes of wealth. But there is certainly more of a part for Athenians of any income class to participate in, to a limited extent, a kind of popular court, the Heliaia, and also in the ecclesia, in the assembly, and also in this council. So in other words, a greater selection of citizens participates in the creation of laws in ancient Athens, but those who carry out the laws are still from the top ranks of Athenian society. And also, Solon also creates something called atimia, which means dishonor, including the abrogation of the rights of your rights of citizenship. This can only be determined by a court, though. So this charge of atimia could be leveled at someone who's becoming a prospective tyrant. A tyrant mainly being someone trying to seize for themselves. So the word tyrannos in ancient Greek gives us our English for tyranny, and you have to be a little careful using it because the English idea, the English word meaning a tyrant, doesn't really capture the idea of a tyrant in ancient Greek. Tyrants aren't necessarily bad, for one thing. They are absolute rulers. The play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, you may know it as. The Greek word is actually Oedipus Tyrannos, so Oedipus, the absolute ruler. Tyrants also power combined with wealth in many cases, and what this does is it subjects the tyrants often to to certain kind of envy and moralizing criticism due to their wealth, which is not to say that it's necessarily, again, a bad thing that tyrants in power. And an example of tyranny in ancient Greece is the example of Peisistratus. You can read about in Herodotus' history. Peisistratus, sorry, rules Athens after seizing power from 560 to 546 BCE, or that is to say, in this period, he was either in control of Athens or in exile. He actually was kicked out at one point and then was able to come back. He ends up dying in 543 BCE, leaving his tyranny to his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. Tyrants generally held the power by some kind of military victory, alignment with the poor, sheer determination, or brute force. In Peisistratus' case, it was really an alignment with the poor, with the demos, a certain amount of determination on coming back from exile, and to some degree, yes, brute force. You can't say that tyranny was necessarily bad for Greece or ancient Athens. Under, for instance, Peisistratus, Athens strikes its first coins of its own. So these are some ancient Athenian coins, namely one showing the head of Athena, patron goddess of Athens. This other one's showing her bird, the owl. And you can see the alpha, beta, epsilon, nu, iota, kappa, in other words, Greek letters spelling out the name of Athens. Under Peisistratus, the Greater Panathenaia, a major Greek festival. It's the festival depicted on the frieze that used to be around the Parthenon in Athens. It's now in the British Museum. Major festival had every 4 years, including competitions with games, competitions of athletic games, competitions of poetry, prizes of olive oil, and also a major transformation of the Acropolis, that center part of Athens, including the building of a temple of Athena and the start of a massive temple to Zeus and the creation of many statues. And this is actually a view of Athens from the Acropolis. So this is how large the city is today. You can get some idea of what it looks like, though, with the plains and the mountains around it. Generally, a feature of Athenian tyranny, ancient Greek tyranny, is that tyrants generally don't last beyond 1 or 2 generations. So Peisistratus does hand over his tyranny, his power, to his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. Hipparchus is assassinated in 514 BCE by these two, Harmodius and Aristogedon. They should be familiar to you because their picture is on the front page of our Sakai site. I did that on purpose because they're known as the tyrannicides, and they fit very much in some ways with the title of our course of Criminals and Saints. So these are two figures who, depending on which side of the tyranny you're on, are criminals or saints. Harmodius, the whole story is told here in Thucydides and his Peloponnesian Wars, some detail, and I gave it to you in my first lecture for the class, but I give it to you again. Harmodius, as you can see, is a younger man. He has no beard, and this is Aristogeiton, who is his lover. But anyways, according to Thucydides, Hipparchus fell in love with Harmodius, and Harmodius did not return his affections because he was already connected with Aristogeiton. And this relationship, by the way, a sexual relationship of an older man and a younger man, both citizens, is not atypical in ancient Athens. Aristogeiton, refusing Harmodius' advances, Aristogeiton, refusing Hipparchus' advances, tells Aristogeiton, the enraged lover, afraid the powerful Hipparchus might take Harmodius by force, immediately formed a design, such as his condition in life permitted, for overthrowing the tyranny. So I guess you could say, an angry lover decides to overthrow the government because the tyrant is directing his affections in the wrong direction. In the meantime, though, Hipparchus wanted to get back at Harmodius and sought to do so by slighting Harmodius' sister, first inviting her to in a procession, a religious festival, and then turning down the offer, saying she was not worthy enough, and so in other words, not showing any respect to her. Enraged at the outrage to his family, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, decide to form try to take action against Hipparchus. So on the Panathenaea, so this great Athenian festival that was instituted under Peisistratus, it's, as it says, Thucydides says, is the sole day upon which citizens forming part of the procession could meet together in arms without suspicion. Aha! So Aristogeiton and Harmodius were to be in the procession, had their weapons ready, and to make a long story short, they assassinate Hipparchus. And the result of this is that Aristogeiton is instantly killed, and Harmodius is instantly killed, and Aristogeiton is, as it says here, afterwards taken and dispatched in no merciful way. So, there are later individuals who say that he was actually tortured. That's how Athens overthrew its tyrants, so to speak. I have to say, there's one confusing aspect of this story, which is who was the reigning tyrant at the time. Namely, the reigning tyrant at the time is actually Hippias, so that other son of Peisistratus. But Hipparchus actually is the brother who ends up getting assassinated in 514 BC. Hippias then rules for a short while afterwards, but gets exiled in 510 BCE and actually ends up among the Persians, where, as we find out, he ends up to some degree helping out the Persians against the Athenians and Spartans in the Persian War. So Harmodius and Aristogeiton are called the tyrannicides, assassinating Hipparchus, and then Hippias, the other brother, is in the possession of the tyranny. Athens, though, after the exile of Hippias, a member of that exiled Achaemenid clan, Cleisthenes, returns to Athens in 510 BCE and institutes what are called the Cleisthenic reforms, leading really to Athenian democracy at its most radical and participatory. And that's the story that we'll definitely look at for next week's lecture. But for this week, we'll stick to the reforms of Solon and the gradual development of democracy in ancient Greece. So again, I will be making a separate video about the long essay, and look for that so you have a chance to develop similar ideas at more length. And as always, stay in touch. Thanks for all your hard work.